Johnny Sports Network here with my latest Bracketology update. And today's Bracketology update is not necessarily going to be about the bubble. Today is going to be a practice bracket as we are less than a month away from Selection Sunday and the reveal of the bracket. And the bracket I'm using is Joe Lunardi's recent bracket. The latest update was done a couple of days ago. And his last four byes are Texas, West Virginia, BYU, and Vanderbilt. His last four in San Diego State, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Wake Forest. First four out VCU, Georgia, SMU, and North Carolina. His next four out Indiana, Xavier, Kansas State, and UC Irvine. The one seeds in each region. In the South region, Auburn, the number one overall seed. In the Midwest, Alabama. In the East, Duke. And in the West, Florida. Starting things off in the South region, Auburn versus the winner of a play-in game between Omaha and Southeast Missouri State. And I have nothing against those two schools at all. It's just that I just feel like this Auburn team is way too talented to lose early on in the tournament. I think Auburn moves on. In the 8-9, Gonzaga and Utah State. Gonzaga, they are not having a strong season like we're used to seeing, but I do think they get past Utah State to move on. In the 5-12, Maryland and the winner between Arkansas and Wake Forest in a play-in game. I have Arkansas winning that play-in game and then moving on, as I have this being one of the upsets in the first round. Arkansas, I feel like they are starting to get onto their stride a little bit, even though they have lost a couple of games that were big opportunities for them to boost their resume. But I do think Arkansas, they move on. St. John's and Arkansas State, I have St. John's moving on as I have been impressed with St. John's throughout the season. And with what's happened recently, despite that, I still think that St. John's is a dark horse to make the Final Four. Ole Miss and UC San Diego State, and these are two of the best teams when it comes to turnover margin. But I just think in the end it's going to come down to the experience that Chris Beard has in the tournament. I think Ole Miss moves on. Wisconsin and Towson, I have Wisconsin moving on. St. Mary's and Texas in the 7-10, I have Texas moving on. From a seeding wise, that would be an upset. But if this was an actual tournament game, I think Texas would be a slight favorite in this matchup, given they are in the SEC and it's the toughest conference of basketball this season. Iowa State and Bryant, the 2-15. I'm going with Iowa State to move on. Going down to the West region, Florida and Norfolk State, I have Florida moving on. And in the 8-9, a strong 8-9 matchup here, Oregon and New Mexico. I read recently that Dana Altman has never lost in the first round of the tournament. I think that continues. So I have Oregon moving on. Marquette and Drake in the 5-12, and I have another 12-5 upset. I have Drake pulling out the upset and moving on, as Shaka Smart, he does not have a good reputation in the tournament since taking VCU to the Final Four. Texas Tech and Akron, and I have Texas Tech moving on. And I think that this could be a close game if this was an actual matchup. I think it's one of those games where we see Akron, they're in the game for a while, but then second half rolls around, Texas Tech, they utilize their talent and their size, and they move on. Clemson and Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt, they have been an up and down team as far as in and out of the bubble picture. I'm going with Clemson to move on. Purdue and Jacksonville State. I am going to go with Purdue. However, I would not be surprised if Purdue was a first round exit this season, because that is sort of the reputation that Matt Painter has. As more often than not, Purdue will be a first round exit. But I do think they move on. Memphis and BYU. Memphis is a team that right now is trending in a bit of the wrong direction, while BYU, they're trending up, and I think that's a difference in this match. If this was the actual matchup, I have BYU moving on. Texas A&M and Montana, the 2-15 matchup in this region. And I think Texas A&M, they move on. Although this Texas A&M team, I don't know what to think of them. 1 week, they look like they can be a candidate to go to the Final Four. And then another week, it feels like they're a first-round exit. This team is just unpredictable, but I had them moving on. Moving on to the Midwest region, Alabama and Quinnipiac. I am going with Alabama. Creighton and Baylor, the 8-9 matchup, and I'm going to go with Baylor on this one. Creighton, they're not exactly meeting the expectations that we thought going into the season. Missouri and Yale, the 5-12. And I was really thinking about picking Yale to pull off the upset. As Yale, they pulled off a first-round upset last season against Auburn. But I think Missouri, they move on. I think out of the 5-12 matchups, it would be one of those where Missouri, they just find a way to win. Michigan and High Point, I'm going with Michigan. Illinois and George Mason, I am going with Illinois. Kentucky and UC Greensboro, and I'm going to pick the upset here because in almost every single tournament, there is a 14, 15, or even a 16 seed pulling off a shocking upset. And Kentucky's been on the wrong end of them for the last couple of years. And I feel like that could be the case again as Mark Pope. The narrative surrounding him right now is that he can't win a tournament game. And I think it does apply. I think UNC Greensboro pulls off the upset. The shocker of the tournament so far. Mississippi State and Nebraska. Nebraska is the only team I believe that's been to a tournament. They've yet to win a tournament game, but I think they do it here against Mississippi State. They pull off the upset and move on. Houston and Cleveland State. I am going with Houston. On to the East region. Duke and the winner of a play-in game between Southern American. I don't think it matters. I have Duke moving on. UConn, Ohio State. I am going with UConn. As bad as UConn has looked this season, I still think they're good enough to get past the first round. Kansas and McNeese State. Kansas is starting to fall apart at the seams. I think McNeese would pull off the upset if they played on Thursday in a tournament game. I have McNeese moving on. Michigan State and Lipscomb. I have Michigan State. UCLA and the winner of a play-in game between San Diego State and Oklahoma. I have San Diego State moving on and pulling off the upset. Arizona and Utah Valley. I have Arizona. Louisville and West Virginia. I think this would be the best 7-10 matchup if this was the actual bracket. But I have Louisville moving on. Tennessee and Central Connecticut. I have Tennessee. On to the second round, Auburn and Gonzaga. Gonzaga, they have made the Sweet 16, I think, 9 years in a row. But I think that would end here. I have Auburn moving on. Arkansas and St. John's. I have St. John's moving on, although I was very close to picking Arkansas to pull off another upset. Ole Miss and Wisconsin. I have Ole Miss. Texas and Iowa State, I have Iowa State moving on. Florida and Oregon, I have Florida. Drake and Texas Tech, I have Texas Tech moving on. Clemson and Purdue, I have Clemson moving on. And BYU and Texas A&M, I have BYU pulling off the upset. Alabama and Baylor, I have Alabama. Missouri and Michigan, I have Missouri. Illinois and UNC Greensboro, I have Illinois moving on. Nebraska and Houston, I have Houston moving on to the Sweet 16. Duke and UConn, which at the beginning of the year you would think that kind of matchup would be at the earliest maybe the Elite Eight. But it's a round of 32 game, and I have Duke moving on as the two-time defending champs are going home in the second round in this bracket. McNeese and Michigan State, I have Michigan State moving on as Tom Izzo, he is a much different coach in March. San Diego State and Arizona, I have San Diego State pulling off the upset and advancing to the Sweet 16, which, given San Diego State's tournament history with Brian Dutcher, it would not necessarily be a surprise. And also given Arizona's recent reputation in the tournament, it wouldn't be a surprise either. Louisville and Tennessee, I have Tennessee moving on to conclude the round of 32. On to the Sweet 16. Auburn and St. John's advancing to the Elite Eight. I have Auburn. Ole Miss and Iowa State, I have Iowa State moving on. Florida and Texas Tech, I think the first one seed falls in this tournament. I have Texas Tech advancing to the Elite Eight. Clemson and BYU, I have Clemson once again going back to the Elite Eight. Alabama and Missouri, I know that Missouri upset Alabama just the other night, just this week. But I think when you think about the tournament being on a neutral court and the experience that Nate Oates has in the tournament, I think that is the difference. Alabama moves on to the Elite Eight. Illinois and Houston, I think Illinois pulls out the upset and advances to the Elite Eight. Duke and Michigan State, and this is appropriately a Sweet 16 kind of matchup. I have Duke moving on, even though Tom Izzo is the more experienced coach this matchup. I just think the talent level for Duke will be the difference in this matchup. San Diego State and Tennessee, I have Tennessee moving on to the Elite Eight. On to the Elite Eight, Auburn and Iowa State advancing to the Final Four. I have Auburn, Texas Tech, and Clemson. I think Clemson, once again, a heartbreaker in the Elite Eight. I have Texas Tech advancing to the Final Four. Alabama and Illinois. I think for the second year in a row, Alabama advances to the Final Four. And Duke and Tennessee to conclude the Elite Eight. And I have Duke moving on as once again, Tennessee falls just short of going to the Final Four. So my Final Four in this practice bracket, Auburn, Texas Tech, Alabama, and Duke. And what I do want to point out from this practice bracket, at least before I move on, Auburn, Alabama, and Duke, no question, are the three best teams in college basketball right now. And Texas Tech, I have been impressed with them all throughout the season, especially as of late. Auburn and Texas Tech advancing to the championship game. I have Auburn. Alabama and Duke, I have Duke advancing to the championship game. Setting up the championship matchup, Auburn and Duke. And we saw these two teams in the ACC-SEC Challenge earlier in the season, and Duke walked away with the victory. They say it's hard to defeat a team multiple times in a season, and I think that applies here. That matchup early on in the season, it was on Duke's home floor, and now we're at a neutral site for this championship game, and I think Auburn, they do win that game and the tournament, as I have Auburn winning it all at this point right now. As much as I think that Duke right now is up there with Alabama as far as second in command, and it's been a while since Duke has won the championship, I just think it's hard to pick against this Auburn team right now. And that will do it for my practice bracket. I am not sure if I'm going to do another one before the actual bracket gets released. But like, share, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, have a good one.